Hello, I am Mamse. Let's explore the world of the cell. This content is composed of three lessons, namely 1. Cell theory, 2. Cell structure and function, and prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. And the third lesson, cell types and cell modifications, with the following learning objectives. Have you answered Activity 1 Quick Response? What is the result of your activity? Let us review your answers. Last March 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 or novel coronavirus 2019 nCoV outbreak a pandemic. Most people infected with this virus will experience mild to moderate respiratory illness and recover without requiring special treatment. But older people and those with serious medical problems are more likely to develop serious illness. Let us answer the questions that follow. 1. Are viruses living or non-living organism? What was your previous answer? Without cells, viruses would not be able to multiply. Therefore, viruses are not living things. I hope you get the correct answer. Second question. Are viruses dead or alive? In the absence of their hosts, viruses are unable to replicate and many are unable to survive for long in the extracellular environment. So viruses are not alive. Are viruses made up of cells? Viruses are not made out of cells. A single virus particle is known as a virion and is made up of a set of genes bundled within a protective protein shell called a capsid. Last question. How can they multiply? Can you recall what was your previous answer? For viruses to multiply, they usually need the support of the cells they infect. Remember that viruses are not considered living, nor do viruses have cells. They are very small, much smaller than the cells of living things, and are basically just packages of nucleic acid and protein. Although living organisms are externally different, internally a horse, a gumamela, and a bacterium are all made of the same building blocks called cells. From the single cells that make up the most basic organisms to the trillion of cells that constitute the complex structure of the human body, every living being on Earth is comprised of cells. Before 15th century, there was no knowledge of cells. Cells were too small to be seen, but with the invention of the microscope, an entirely new world was discovered, where very large objects like humans are in fact made up of billions of tiny individual pieces called cells. A Dutch father-son team named Hans and Zacharias Janssen invented the first so-called compound microscope in the late 16th century, when they discovered that if they put lens at the top and bottom of a tube and looked through it, objects on the other end became magnified. On 1665, cell first observed. Robert Hooke, an English scientist, discovered a honeycomb-like structure in a quark slice using a primitive compound microscope. He only saw cell walls, as this was dead tissue. He coined the term cell for these individual compartments he saw. In Filipino, the translation for the word cell is sihay, which means silid ng buhay. In 1676, first living cells seen. Anton van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch biologist, looked at pond water with a microscope he made lenses for. Anton van Leeuwenhoek made several more discoveries on a macroscopic level, eventually publishing a letter to the Royal Society in which he included detailed drawings of what he saw. Among these was the first protozoa and bacteria discovered. On 1859, Louis Pasteur contributed to the cell theory by disproving spontaneous generation. He was the first scientist to prove that cells can only form from pre-existing cells. On 1831, the center of the cell seen. Robert Brown, an English botanist, discovered the nucleus in plant cells. On 1838, basic building blocks. Matthias Jacobs Schleiden, a German botanist, proposes that all plant tissues are composed of cells, and that cells are the basic building blocks of all plants. This statement was the first generalized statement about cells. Theodor Swann, a German botanist, reached the conclusions that not only plants but animal tissues as well is composed of cells. This ended debates that plants and animals were fundamentally different in structure. Rudolf Virchow, a German physiologist, physician, pathologist, added a third part to the cell theory. The original is Greek and states omnis cellula e cellula, which means life comes from life. He was also the first to propose that disease cells come from healthy cells. The cell theory is a unifying principle of biology. Collectively, the concepts of these scientists were summarized into what is known today as the cell theory, which states the following. All living organisms are composed of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. All cells come from pre-existing cells. Cell is the basic unit of life. Cells may be prokaryotic, a unicellular, or eukaryotic, a multicellular. Cells come in different shapes and sizes. All these cells are composed of organelles which have specific functions to carry out life. For example, the primary function of the sperm is to pass on the necessary biological information required to produce a new organism. Cells divide and form many cells where its three main parts are cell membrane, nucleus, and cytoplasm. As with the rapid growth of molecular biology in the mid-20th century, cell biology research exploded and formulated another set of cell theory. The modern version of the cell theory includes the ideas that 1. Energy flow occurs within cells. 2. Heredity information or DNA is passed on from cell to cell. Third, all cells have the basic chemical composition. The energy of organisms is formed in the cell. The organelle called mitochondria manufactures food to make energy in the form of ATP or adenosine triphosphate molecule. In the form of ATP, energy can be stored, transferred, and transformed in a living system. DNA is passed on from cell to cell. Prior to cell division, DNA is being replicated or copied so that the offspring will have the DNA of its parents. Lastly, all cells have the basic chemical composition. Living cells are mainly made up of four elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Without these molecules, life would not exist. Just a recap, cell theory is composed of 6 postulates. First, all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. Second, the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. These postulates were formulated by Swann and Schleiden. Third, all cells come from pre-existing cells, or omnis cellula e cellula by Virchow. The succeeding postulates are composed of energy flow occurs within cells, heredity information or DNA is passed on from cell to cell, and all cells have the same basic chemical composition. Cells have many structures inside of them called organelles. These organelles are like the organs in a human and they help the cell stay alive. Each organelle has its own specific function to help the cell survive. On the other hand, prokaryotic cells are cells that do not have a true nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. Organisms within the domains bacteria and archaea have prokaryotic cells, while other forms of life are eukaryotic, such as animal and plant cells. Why cells are so small? Cells have limits in size. Most cells in living things have the same size. There will be problems if a cell is too small or too large. Take note, cell size is limited in accordance with the ratio of cell surface area to its volume. If a cell is too small, it couldn't contain all the organelles and nutrients necessary for survival. If a cell was too big, the cell couldn't get enough water, nutrients, and oxygen into the cell to live. The cell couldn't remove its waste. The DNA couldn't make enough proteins to support the cell. Our key points here are, as a cell grows, its volume increases much more rapidly than its surface area. Since the surface of the cell is what allows the entry of oxygen, large cells cannot get as much as oxygen as they would need to support themselves. As animals increase in size, they require specialized organs that effectively increase the surface area available for exchange processes. Here are the examples. Neurons is a cell that can be flat and thin instead of a cube-like. An intestine has a cell that can increase surface area by having folds in cell membrane. Cell specialization or modification or differentiation is actually a process that occurs after cell division where the newly formed cells are structurally modified so that they can perform their function efficiently and effectively. Examples of cell that undergo cell modification will be given later. Cell modification could be apical, basal, or lateral, yet we will only focus on apical cell modification. Apical modification is specialized to carry out functions that occur at these interfaces, including secretion, absorption, and movement of aluminal content. Cilia are projections and a type of organelle seen on the apical surface of epithelial cells. In many locations, they beat in a coordinated fashion, while flagella are filamentous protein structures attached to the cell surface that provide the swimming movement for most motile prokaryotes. Microvilli are cell surface modifications which increase surface area of a cell without significantly increasing the size of the cell. They work in conjunction with villi to absorb more nutrients and more material because they expand the surface area of the intestine. Another example is a pseudopod. Pseudopod comes from the Greek word pseudes and podos, meaning falls and fit, respectively. A pseudopod is a temporary arm-like projection that is developed in the direction of the movement. Here is an example of amoeba engulfing a food. Root hair cells are actually modified epidermal cells of the roots. Its function is to absorb water and mineral salts by osmosis and active transport, respectively. Thank you for your attention. I'm encouraging you to ask questions. Keep on learning.